Hello, everybody. My name is Maurice Button. I'm the CEO of City and Financial Global, and it's my great pleasure to be interviewing Matt Townsend, who's a partner at Allen and Overy. And Matt will be speaking at our Economic Sanctions Summit, being held at the Cavendish Conference Centre in London on the 31st of January. Matt, welcome.
Thanks very much.
Let's get stuck into the questions, Matt. The first one, the freezing of substantial assets held by Russian banks has obviously had a significant impact on the financial services sector. Which other key sectors have been impacted, and how can banks keep abreast of how their customers are potentially affected?
Yeah, it's absolutely had a significant effect. A kind of chilling effect is how I describe it. And pretty much across the board, any major financial institution, whether it be a bank, pension fund, asset manager, or private capital fund that has a nexus to Russia, has been hit, as we've witnessed, with a blizzard of sanctions over the last 12 months in particular. And I think one of the challenges for institutions here, particularly when it comes to asset freezes, because they're severe, they're immediate, they are the most aggressive form of sanction, is being able to respond quickly and decide what to do rapidly and get the organization into a position where they are robustly in compliance. So obviously major institutions that were holding funds on behalf of Russians who were subject to asset freezes, they're the obvious example. Where we've seen the real complexity arise, though, is through the commercial arrangements, whether that's through loans, bond programs, GDRs, a whole range of different instruments, derivative instruments, where there's a Russian counterparty somewhere in the kind of web, as it were, that's subject to an asset freeze target, or indeed similar restriction under US rules as an SDN blocked person. And that requires real kind of detailed analysis, and that takes time to work out, well, do we have to unravel this structure? What do we do? Do we need a license? And how do we deal with that? And that was very much the kind of feature of that, particularly the first 6 months. But as you well know, we've also seen a drip feed of names being put on the list on a constant basis, pretty much week on week. So it's very much a rolling program.
Okay. And how much government and regulatory cooperation are you seeing between the UK, Europe and the US to try to develop a more consistent approach to Russia?
Well, actually, this has been quite a surprising feature, actually, of the last 12 months or so. In many cases, actually, there's a high degree of cooperation between the regulators you talk about, the jurisdictions you mention. There's very much kind of coordination over the nature, extent, and scope of the sanctions. They're not all on identical terms, so there are some very subtle differences between the three regimes. So it's not like it was in 2014, 2015. Well, certainly as between the EU and the US, and of course that was all pre-Brexit. There was a very high degree of consistency in approaching the structure of the sanctions, the type of sanctions deployed. Probably seen a little bit less of that, but I think from a kind of policy perspective, much greater coordination and consistency. And of course, there is now a greater nuance of difference between the UK and the EU. When it comes to enforcement, we are seeing actually a greater level of coordination between regulators. They are talking to each other more. I think one of the sticky points, though, has been around licensing, where if you imagine a major financial institution sitting in London may need a license, obviously under the UK regime, but potentially in the US, possibly in the EU. And there's very little real coordination between the regulators through that process. So that's proving a little bit cumbersome, I think it's fair to say. I think the other feature here, as between the regulators, there's an awful lot of what us lawyers would call soft law in all of this, guidance documents, FAQs, and so forth. And that's we spend a lot of time ploughing through that as we try and interpret the kind of hard law, as it were, and that's where you do see some quite significant divergences. So I think the short answer to the question is it's better than it was 12, 13, 14 months ago, but there are still some quite significant differences both in substance and approach.
Okay, so some scope for improvement perhaps on that coordination part. What advice would you give to organisations seeking to extricate any business presence in or links to Russia? And are there any relevant precedents for the current situation?
So if I can deal with the last question first, if I may. I mean, the playbook for this, I think, has been maybe up until the kind of autumn, actually, was obviously Iran. That's the obvious comparator. Although how those sanctions were rolled out was a little bit different. The kind of rapidity in which the Russia sanctions were rolled out has been really quite stark and quite unique. The nature of the sanctions, pretty surgical, actually. I mean, many of them are as you will well know, and those who will attend the conference will hear, they are very targeted, built out of trade priorities. And of course, the biggest card was played last around the kind of oil sector. So certainly, if you'd have asked me that question in the summer, I'd say, well, we're tracking pretty much Iran and the rollout, but it's taken a very different course. I think it's fair to say at this stage. And I think there's still quite a lot of space to move. I mean, in a sense, Europe and the US and the UK have played their cards in some of the kind of obvious areas: financial services, oil services, and importantly, an area that people talk about less, and that's kind of export controls and product-related restrictions. So there's potentially a bit more room there for further sanctions, but absolutely a kind of, in a sense, an unprecedented landscape that I think many businesses are facing. To your first question, just very briefly,
Yes.
I mean, we saw a significant wave of businesses exit Russia, and it's really gone in phases, I think it's fair to say. For some businesses, it was relatively straightforward. Close the business down. They may have a relatively limited footprint there, pull people out, and away you go. The second kind of option that we saw take was basically an MBO. And those essentially had the characteristics of fire sales. It was done pretty quickly, sold to management for, in many cases, for a much lower value of the business, and away you go. I think the businesses that are still there have basically either turned, or Western businesses that are still there have turned those businesses into an island as best they can. So letting the Russia operations kind of just get on with it. Or there are a number where the supply chains and the business integration is complicated. And so it's not just a question of kind of selling up and away you go. This issue around kind of transitional services and the ability to support a business and the handover of a business as a major corporate exits Russia has proved quite challenging because of the professional service restrictions that we see across the US, Europe and the UK. So it's very much a kind of mixed picture, but the direction of travel has been clear, although there's clearly a lot of investment interest from different parts of the world who are looking at opportunities in Russia.
Yes. And there's some speculation in the press, I think it's in the FT recently, that maybe it's become more difficult to extricate yourself. Permissions aren't being given quite so readily. And the state is beginning to see an opportunity, the Russian state, to intervene a bit more actively. I mean, I look forward very much, Matt, to being able to hear more on these topics at the conference, the Economic Sanctions Summit, again for our viewers at the Cavendish Conference Centre, London, on the 31st of January, and where we'll be tackling a number of relevant issues under this heading. So, Matt, thank you very much indeed. We look forward to seeing you on the 31st of January.
Thank you.